All right, thank you. It's really exciting to be here. I want to thank everybody for inviting me down for that wonderful introduction. It's really exciting to get to come and talk to all of you. This is one of the topics that is always really fun to talk about because it's meaningful to a whole variety of audiences, and I can mix hard science with some situations that everybody can relate to. So, as you mentioned, I'm a herpetologist and a conservation biologist. Throughout my career, I've been used to working to save snakes and save reptiles and work for us to understand how important these animals are. And for me, it's been a pretty big learning experience to become involved with the situation of an invasive snake species in Florida. I've learned a lot about the biology of these animals as well as this situation that seems to be unfolding in that area. So today I'm going to try to not only give you some of the hard facts that are behind this issue. Obviously, this is one that's been widely discussed in the popular media. Some truthfully, some there's an awful lot of storytelling that goes on, so I'm going to give you some of the facts, some of the science that's going on, and some of the directions that I see this issue heading, and what we're doing as scientists to try to understand these snakes. So we live in a time now when virtually no part of our planet is immune to the impacts that humans are having on the environment. These include direct impacts, things like pollution or outright habitat destruction or deforestation. Also subtler effects like, say, the effects of climate change or subtler pollutants that we don't see as obviously. Now, among the various threats to wildlife and native ecosystems in the United States, I would argue that invasive species are one that is a growing issue that is not getting enough scientific attention. A recent review that came out that sort of ranked the various threats to native ecosystems in terms of how many species they affect versus how much science is being conducted on them. You'll see that exotic species are affecting a huge number of native species, but a disproportionately small amount of research is being conducted on them, say, compared to things like habitat loss or overexploitation. Now, of course, invasive species come in all different shapes and sizes. Some of them are all around us. Many invasive plants are pervasive in the landscape. Some others, species that we like to think of as our friends, like our pets, can become dangerous invasives under certain situations. There's pretty good evidence that feral cats are one of the biggest problems for birds in many regions. But perhaps no invasive species have grabbed the attention of the scientific community, landowners and managers, and of course the general public as this idea of a giant invasive snake now established in Florida. So this is the animal we're talking about. This is the Burmese or Indian python, Python malurus. It's one of the largest snakes in the world, native to much of southern and southeastern Asia. As you can tell, it's a beautiful animal. This is a snake that I was captivated with as a kid, and many people worldwide have seen these as beautiful animals. They do very well in captivity, and for that reason, they've become one of the most common animals in the pet trade for at least 3 decades now. So since the 1970s or 80s, it's been quite easy to go down to your local pet store, buy a cute little baby Burmese python, could live in a little 10-gallon aquarium, it's relatively easy to keep, feeds well, it's fun to handle. But a few years down the road, you're stuck with an animal that looks like this. And although this is an impressive animal, and say if you're a young male in college wanting to impress women, this is one way to do it. But this is an animal that's really beyond the scope of most recreational keepers to take care of. This is an animal that eats large prey items, needs a large enclosure, and really is beyond the scope of the standard recreational hobbyist to take care of. For this reason, when they get this size, many people no longer want them. And unfortunately, when you have a snake this size, it's very hard to get rid of it. Most zoos or nature centers have their one giant snake. They don't really want another. These are hard to adopt out. And for that reason, historically, quite a few pet owners have released their snakes into the wild under the misguided assumption that they're doing the best thing for the snake versus, say, euthanizing it. And unfortunately, this has led over time to establishment of an invasive population of these snakes in and around the Florida Everglades in South Florida. So since about the early 2000s, these snakes started to show up in southern parts of Everglades National Park. Started out in the early 2000s with just 1 or 2 a year, people assumed that they were probably just recently released animals or ones that escaped from their owners. But fairly quickly it became clear that these were not just released animals, that there was an established population starting to expand in the region. And now it's not too uncommon, especially if you know where and when to look, to see a snake like this. Most often the way that most people see them is crossing a road in Everglades National Park. This is a favorite photo of mine that a friend of mine took. This is a wild python crossing the road at night right in front of the main gate to Everglades National Park, right at the main entrance there. So fairly quickly it became apparent that these snakes were not just released animals, that there was an established and reproducing population in the region. These snakes not only grow large, but they have incredible fertility. In captivity they can lay over 100 eggs. In the Everglades, the record now stands, I think, at 87 eggs for a clutch for one female. Unlike most snakes, the female actually stays with the eggs and guards them throughout gestation or throughout incubation. And actually, pythons are able to do a really unique behavior among snakes, which is called shivering thermogenesis. And this is where they clench their muscles, and they're so big that they can actually generate a little bit of metabolic heat, which virtually no other reptiles can do. And that allows them, presumably, to more adequately maintain the temperature of their nest until their eggs hatch. They also get very large in South Florida. This has been in my talk for a while. This was the record snake as of about 2 years ago. It's about 16.5 feet long or so. There have now been, I think, 3 or 4 individuals bigger than this one found. There were 2 last summer that were in the 17.5 foot range, and then one this summer that was over 18 feet long. So they get very large in Florida, and that maximum size seems to be continuing to increase as these snakes get older and continue to grow. The number of snakes captured over time has increased steadily. As I mentioned, they were first seen in any numbers in the early 2000s, and very rapidly those numbers spiked up to a couple of hundred being captured per year. These are snakes being removed and turned into the National Park Service. And so total over the last 5 years or so, over 2,000 snakes now have been collected in and around Everglades National Park and surrounding areas. They've also expanded fairly considerably in geographic range. The first animals were found way down in some of the most remote areas of Everglades National Park in the mangrove sections near Flamingo. Quite rapidly, snakes began to turn up really throughout the greater Everglades ecosystem. Until now, there are records showing up well north of Alligator Alley, I-75, and this area doesn't get surveyed very much, but snakes seem to be showing up in some of those areas as you get closer and closer to Lake Okeechobee. For those of you who aren't familiar with Florida, I'll point out that we're talking about really big areas here. This is a scale of 25 miles. So this area where they're spread now, this is in the last 10 years, they spread over an area that's covering 3,000 to 4,000 square miles. This is a huge area, and most of this area is impenetrable wilderness. These are areas that you can only access with an airboat or a helicopter or a plane. There's only a couple of roads that penetrate this and canals that penetrate this wilderness. So I've been lucky enough to be involved in Python research in a variety of ways. This is a large multidisciplinary research team that's come together to study these snakes and try and not only understand their biology, but perhaps try to evaluate ways that we could help to curb this problem. So several of the general areas that we're looking at are the general biology of these animals, the impact they may be having on native wildlife and ecosystems. We've done some population work to look at population growth and use that to assess how they may have been introduced, when they may have been introduced, and how many of them there may be. And finally, I'll touch a little bit on the idea of range expansion, which is the most controversial aspect of Python research and is one that has gotten a lot of attention, but I think there's still really no good answer to. I'll also take this opportunity to thank the many other folks that are involved in this research, particularly Mike Dorcas at Davidson College, who was my undergraduate mentor and who I continue to collaborate with extensively on this research, as well as numerous collaborators from the National Park Service, USGS, University of Florida, and many other agencies. So some of this work is mine, but an awful lot of it is collaborative. So I'm going to start out by talking about the impacts that pythons may be having on native ecosystems. Obviously, this was almost the foremost concern when pythons started to become common, is how are they impacting the Everglades? Is this something that we need to worry about really affecting our ecosystem? So the most obvious way that pythons are going to be affecting native wildlife is through predation. These are generalist predators that feed on a wide array of different animals. And starting from day one, documenting what pythons are eating has been a major focus of python research. So this involves necropsying, individuals that are turned in and euthanized, looking for prey items in their stomach, or things like claws or teeth, as well as a few anecdotal observations where pythons have actually been seen in the act of consuming other wildlife. This is a white ibis. Here's a great blue heron. This is a good example of how tough these snakes are. You can see the heron's beak poking into the snake's neck as it's being swallowed. So the list of animals the pythons eat is very extensive at this point. Pretty much includes almost all of the native mammals and birds found in South Florida. Everything from small rodents like rats and mice, all the way up to bobcats, otters, and full-grown white-tailed deer. Some of these species are ones that we're particularly concerned about because they're either endemic to Florida or they're federally or locally protected. A key example of this is the Key Largo woodrat. This is the Key Largo woodrat. It's probably one that you haven't heard of, but it's one that we've been worried about for a long time because it's only found on Key Largo. It's found in a very small area on Key Largo. Estimates suggest that there are only about 200 of these left. They're critically endangered. The first python that showed up on Key Largo had 2 of these in its stomach, so had 1% of the population of Key Largo woodrats in its stomach. They also eat a wide array of birds, particularly the larger marsh and wading birds. Pretty much all of the herons, egrets, rails, ducks, the larger birds that would be a suitable size prey item. Again, some of these are either federally or state protected. And of course, many of these are the charismatic, beautiful birds that people come to the Everglades to see. These are why tourists come to the Everglades. We've also documented now numerous cases of pythons eating alligators. This is a photo that made the rounds in the media a few years ago. It's a snake that apparently ate about a 6 or 7 foot alligator, died, and the alligator started to rot and kind of exploded out of its body. So this was a fairly large alligator. Most of the alligators that we've recorded have been smaller. And of course, large alligators will also eat pythons, so they seem to be sort of duking it out for the top predator role in the Everglades. Just to give you an idea of what these snakes are capable of, this is about a 15-foot female that was caught a year ago November. It was very obvious when she was caught that she had recently eaten a very large prey item. You can see the bulge in her stomach right here. And when we cut her open, she had a full-grown 80-pound doe white-tailed deer in her stomach. So these snakes are really pretty much capable of eating any mammal or bird found in the Everglades. So, of course, we know these snakes are eating a wide variety of native wildlife, but our main question was, are they eating enough of them to be changing things? Are they eating enough of them to be causing declines in some of these species? And we addressed this question by basically using systematic surveys of mammals to see if there had been changes either over time or over space as pythons have spread throughout the region. So we focused on mid-sized mammals, things like raccoons, opossums, and rabbits, for a couple of reasons. One, these are common prey items in snake diets. They're some of the most prevalent prey items we found. They're also easily surveyed for because they like to cross roads and they often get run over. So what we did was we systematically drove stretches of roads at night, looked for mammals either running across the road or as roadkill, and we conducted several different sets of surveys. We did one set that focused on the core of where pythons have been found, where they were first found, where they've been found the longest, and where they're currently most abundant. This is in the heart of Everglades National Park. And we had a set of surveys there that was conducted before pythons were encountered with any kind of frequency back in the 1990s. And then an extensive set of road surveys that was conducted since pythons have become common in that area. We supplemented this with surveys that spanned the spatial extent of the python's expansion. So we surveyed 4 sites that we call peripheral, that are in areas where pythons are now found, but they've only been found there more recently, and they don't seem to be as common as in the heart of the Everglades. And then 2 sites that were in similar habitat that were north of the area currently occupied by pythons. So I'll show you some data here. These are going to be effort-corrected observation rates during our survey. So we're going to show you the number of mammals we saw per 100 kilometers that we drove in these surveys. We'll start out with before pythons were common. And you'll see that pre-pythons, the Everglades had what I would consider to be a pretty standard mammal community, fairly high numbers of especially raccoons and opossums. This is, if you add these two up, it's getting to about one snake for or one mammal for every 20 kilometers driven or so, which seems about right to me. Smaller numbers of carnivores, things like bobcats and foxes, rabbits, which may be active a little bit more during the day. Now I'll put up the data for our recent surveys since pythons have become common. So we've driven almost 57,000 kilometers on the main park road in Everglades in recent years. And total in that time, we've seen 9 raccoons, 5 opossums, no rabbits, and just a few bobcats. So these are declines in observation rate of anywhere from 85 to 100% in the case of marsh rabbits. As far as I know, nobody's seen a wild marsh rabbit along the main park road in the heart of the Everglades in the last 6 or 7 years. Marsh rabbits used to be abundant there, especially in the morning. People would see them running across the road constantly. So we've seen dramatic declines over time. If we look at it over space, we see a similar pattern. In peripheral locations, so areas where pythons have only recently become established, we see sort of intermediate mammal densities. Not as high as historical Everglades data, but still fair numbers. And outside of where pythons are found, we see mammal abundances that are pretty similar to what we saw historically in the Everglades, and especially raccoons are way back up where they were pre-pythons in the heart of the Everglades. So we know that pythons are consuming a wide range of native species, especially mammals and birds. We've seen that they seem to be having strong impacts on especially some of the mid-sized species, the raccoons, possums, rabbits, and those types of species. We're currently trying to assess what effects they're having on wading birds. This is, of course, much more difficult because wading birds move around a lot more and they're able to disperse throughout the peninsula. So that research is ongoing. We're also concerned with some of the rarer species that simply don't occur enough in our surveys to really say much about them, but things like the Florida panther that is an endangered species that we suspect could be suffering from pythons, but we really don't know enough because we don't see them very often. We might also expect that these direct effects might be supplemented by indirect effects. So the Everglades is a really complex place. You might imagine that these effects can cascade out and have effects on other species. So for example, disappearance of rabbits might also have negative effects on some of the predators. Likewise, we may even have positive effects in some cases. So for instance, disappearance of raccoons and opossums might benefit nesting of things like turtles and songbirds. These are major nest predators in many areas, so we might actually expect pythons to benefit some of our bird and turtle species. These are avenues of research that we're currently pursuing to sort of see what the wider spread effects might be on the greater Everglades ecosystem. So we've seen that pythons are having strong impacts, and I think this really draws a broader attention to the role that snakes may play as invasive species in general. If any of you guys recognize this species, this is the brown tree snake, which if you take a biology class, this is one of the classic textbook case studies of how detrimental an invasive species can be. These were introduced from New Guinea or Australia to the island of Guam. It's a US territory of Guam in the 1950s, around World War II. Within a few decades, they had spread dramatically throughout the island and basically driven to extinction almost all of the island's native birds and bats. And currently, the US spends millions of dollars a year trying to get rid of these snakes to not only protect native wildlife, but to avoid conflicts with people. So these snakes also cause power outages frequently because they get into transformer boxes and cause other impacts like that. Now, when I first read about this in a textbook, I thought that the reason this situation was so bad was more because it was an island than because it was a snake. And I think this situation in Florida is maybe making us reconsider this and wondering if snakes may have some biological traits that make them potentially more detrimental than other species as invasives. Now, unfortunately, in addition to Burmese pythons, we have several other cases of incipient invasive snake populations. So I think, unfortunately, we're actually going to have the chance to see if this repeats itself in other cases because there are going to be additional snakes that are going to be spreading in the future. So we've got Burmese pythons in Florida. We also have African rock pythons, which is essentially the African cousin of the Burmese python. It's a very ecologically similar species. They're established more recently, in just the last 5 or 6 years, in a small area in the northern part of the Everglades. We have boa constrictors established. There's a small population that's been there for actually quite a while in almost urban Miami. They're also established on the islands of Aruba, Cozumel, and most recently Puerto Rico. They seem to be exploding pretty rapidly in Puerto Rico. Some of our native water snakes, so these are actually 2 species of native water snakes, non-venomous, harmless water snakes, that are native to the eastern US. In fact, both of these species are found in Arkansas, where they're native. They're a part of our native fauna that's critical to native ecosystems, but they're introduced in California. And as of right now, they're fairly locally distributed, but we can imagine that if they proliferate and become more widespread, they might threaten native fishes, amphibians, and potentially compete with other native snakes. There are some very rare garter snakes that are ecologically pretty similar to these water snakes in California. And this is maybe my favorite case here. It's recently come to our attention that the Canary Islands, which are a tropical group of islands off of Africa, a popular tourist destination, also has an invasive snake problem. They're catching lots and lots of these white, medium-sized snakes. Turns out these snakes are albino California king snakes. So this is a snake that's native to the western US. Albinos are a common color variant in the pet trade. And I think this provides a pretty direct connection between the pet trade and some of these snake introductions. All right, I can move on and talk a little bit about some of the population work we've done. And this involves both modeling to look at potential scenarios that may have led to their introduction, as well as trying to assess how many of these snakes we may have to remove to start to get rid of them. So obviously, since this issue became widespread, it's grabbed the media on a very, very regular basis. You see articles like this on an almost weekly basis. Many of these articles are filled with misinformation or statements that are portrayed as fact when there's really no supporting evidence at all. Great example, for any of you who know your snakes, this is a carpet python, not a Burmese python. These are not established in Florida, at least as far as we know. But one of the aspects of this whole python situation that the media love to talk about is how it started, what caused this problem. And you see media stories portrayed all the time that state, as if it's fact, a whole variety of different ways in which these snakes may have gotten there. Everything from very benign stories, such as misguided pet owners intentionally or unintentionally releasing their snakes into the wild. I'll let you decide which one is the misguided pet owner here. To conspiracy theories of the government introducing these snakes on purpose to somehow ban snakes as pets, which is crazy to me. But the one that comes out most frequently is the idea that Hurricane Andrew started this whole thing. And this has been stated as fact in numerous publications. And the fact is, there's been very little historical evaluation of what support there is for Hurricane Andrew starting this situation. There certainly are reptile dealers outside Miami, importers or breeders. It's plausible that Hurricane Andrew could have destroyed a warehouse or a pet dealer and spread the snakes around. But we decided to actually take a scientific approach and see, does the biological information support the idea that Hurricane Andrew started this whole situation? So we did this in 2 different ways. First, we constructed population models. So basically what these are they're fairly simple mathematical models that take biological information, ecological information on these snakes, such as growth rates, litter sizes, survival rates, and see basically from those data how fast populations could grow. How fast would you expect populations to increase? And what we did was plotted population growth based on situations where we started with differing numbers of founder snakes, differing numbers introduced to begin with. And what we did then was to match this up with how does the timeline of these introductions match up with Hurricane Andrew. And if we draw a line here for Hurricane Andrew, at the time we wrote this paper, basically what we see is that in order to get to what we would consider to be a plausible current population size, I'll get into a minute about how we really have no idea how many snakes are out there, but there's certainly multi-thousand of them. And in order to get anything over 10,000 snakes out there in the wild, you had to start with several hundred founders to start that population and get that population going quickly enough to get to where we are now, starting with Hurricane Andrew. Now the problem is, it's plausible that destruction of a warehouse or something could release several hundred animals, but the spatial data and temporal data in terms of where and when these snakes have been found don't match up very well with that idea. So most of the reptile dealers outside Miami are on the western side of Miami here, whereas, as I mentioned before, the area where pythons were first found, the area where reproduction was first confirmed, and the area where, at least for quite a while, they were most common is way out here in the southern portions of Everglades near Flamingo. This is 30 miles plus away from any of these areas that would have reptile dealers. And so if you put these two lines of evidence together, it suggests that for Hurricane Andrew to have started this, we would have had to transport several hundred animals from here to here without sprinkling them in between. And I should mention that it took several years, but now pythons are found all throughout this whole area. So it's not like the habitat's unsuitable. It makes much more sense that the problem started here and probably dates back well before Hurricane Andrew. So we think that probably the most plausible idea is that a few snakes were released either intentionally or unintentionally to this southern part of Everglades, probably back in at least the 80s, maybe even as early as the 70s. And in fact, if you look at some of the lesser read literature, there are some early reports. Nobody caught one or put it in a museum, but there were reports of people seeing large snakes in this region dating back to that time period. So we think that this is much more plausible than the Hurricane Andrew hypothesis that gets circulated in the media fairly consistently. We can also use the same modeling approach to figure out how many snakes we would need to remove to start to control this population. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this graph, but basically what we see is that if we start with anything over 100,000 animals, we're going to have to remove a good chunk of that population every year to even start to put the population into decline. With 10,000 animals, we're talking about 1,500 animals a year would have to be removed. That's 5 times what we've been doing. And if we're over that, it's going to be much higher. So the take-home message here is that in order to stop the spread of these, we're going to have to remove an awful lot of animals, and it depends critically on how many are out there. And this is the single biggest piece of missing information we have right now. Unfortunately, estimating population size or density for snakes is incredibly difficult. They are very, very hard to find. The typical technique we use as wildlife ecologists to estimate population size is a technique that's called mark recapture. We mark animals, we release them again, and when we catch new animals, we see what proportion are marked versus unmarked. The problem is you mark snakes, you let them go, and you never see them again. They are that secretive. And of course, in a situation like the pythons, you don't want to be releasing them again to begin with. So currently, we know we've got good ways to catch them, and we can use some data from the native range or some sort of scant estimates to project roughly how many snakes there might be. So we've got a couple of estimates of density from their native range. These are Python malurus, Burmese or Indian pythons in India, 5 per kilometer squared. African pythons get up to 75 per kilometer squared. They mowed a 30-acre piece in the Everglades this summer. This was a habitat restoration experiment. And if you project out the number of snakes they killed while they were mowing, you get actually an estimate that's higher than either of these native range estimates. So if we use these as bookends, 5 and 83, we get just within Everglades National Park itself densities of anywhere from 30,000 to 600,000 animals. And you'll remember that they're found way up here now. So the total area is probably 3 or 4 times the area in Everglades National Park. So we're certainly talking about tens of thousands of animals, probably more like hundreds of thousands. So we know we have good ways to catch these animals. One of the best ways is to drive roads at night. In the summertime, they tend to move mostly at night, and you can see them crossing roads like this. In the wintertime, they tend to bask when the weather gets cool, and so it's often possible to find multiple individuals on a cool morning in the winter. There's a group from Auburn working to train essentially bomb-sniffing dogs, trained detector dogs, to find pythons. This is met with limited success. They seem to be better than people at finding pythons, but the same areas that we can't search as people, the aquatic areas and those impenetrable habitats, the dogs can't really work there either. So it's not a golden arrow. It's maybe better than a person, but it's definitely not a golden arrow. Various trap designs have been tested. They have caught snakes, but the effort required to trap a python, these are pretty much ambush predators, so they spend most of their time hiding and waiting for prey to come to them. So even if you bait these with a rat or something, it's very seldom that you actually get a snake in the trap. So we're refining our ways to catch them, we're refining our ways to figure out how many there are, but we're nowhere near a large-scale solution. We're thinking much smaller scale right now in terms of, say, protecting nesting bird rookeries or protecting suburban areas where they might be coming in contact with people. All right, so I'm going to finish up with a little discussion of the range expansion question. This has been probably the most controversial aspect of Python ecology, and one that I would argue still has no good answer at all, but I'll give you some information on what's been done that might give you some idea of whether this is a Florida problem or whether this is something we have to worry about in other areas of the US. So the technique that's been used most frequently to try and assess how far these snakes could spread is a technique that's called climate modeling or climate matching or niche modeling. This is basically where we take climate of areas where they're known to be found in their native range and try and match that to where conditions are the same in the potential invasive range. So we take areas where they're found in Asia, we say where are the temperatures similar to that in the US, and we figure out what area could possibly be invaded. Now for me, one of the sort of scariest things about these snakes is we tend to think about pythons as being tropical animals, but they're really not. They certainly do occur in very tropical areas in Southeast Asia, but they also occur in very arid habitats in India, all the way up into the foothills of the Himalayas in Nepal, Pakistan. There are populations in central China, areas where it definitely gets fairly cool in the winter. These are decidedly sort of temperate areas. So it's not surprising that if you take this whole range and project it onto the United States, this is essentially what you get. This was a study done by the USGS back in 2008. They used simply temperature and precipitation to try to identify areas of suitable climate. And they found that almost probably a quarter to a third of the United States was apparently suitable in terms of temperature and precipitation for these pythons. Everything from Washington, D.C. across, this includes Little Rock, probably not Fayetteville, so I'm safe, you guys aren't, all the way across the southern portion of the United States. Now, this was met with lots and lots of controversy. There have been other studies done that have used similar approaches and come up with quite different answers. This is another version that used many, many more climate variables, 19 different climate variables that included all sorts of strange things like humidity in the warmest month, or temperature range in the middle month, or things that definitely you're unsure how they tie to the biology of the animals. But the point is, you can come up with vastly different results depending on how you do this climate modeling. I would say that most of these studies that have been done appropriately suggest something between this range and this range. So I think one fairly basic answer is this is probably not just a South Florida problem. It's probably at least a peninsular Florida problem, probably a Gulf Coast problem. I think jury is still very much out on the rest of the sort of central and southern United States. But we saw this, and we decided, hey, let's stop climate modeling, and let's actually directly test this a little bit. And so what we did at this time, I was working at the Savannah River Ecology Lab, which is in central South Carolina. We said, hey, let's bring snakes from Florida, bring them to South Carolina, and see what happens. See if they can make it through the winter in South Carolina. So that's exactly what we did. We actually had a pre-built snake-proof enclosure that had been used in snake research previously. It had a fairly large pond in it, as well as a variety of habitats. We did the best we could to create a sort of semi-natural habitat, although certainly nothing like they would have out in the wild. And we brought 10 male pythons up from Florida and kept them into the winter in South Carolina, and saw how they did in terms of their behavior, their thermal biology, and eventually their survival as we went into winter. So this was 2010. I don't know if you guys had it here, but in South Carolina, this was the coldest winter in at least 100 years. Culminating in 2 weeks of seriously cold weather where I could actually walk on their pond for almost 2 weeks straight. It was that cold. This is weather unlike I'd seen in South Carolina in my whole time there. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the snakes didn't make it through this. But some snakes made it pretty far. And so I think this is a suggestion that maybe they can't get quite as far as all the way up to as far as that RADA model predicted. But I think we saw that these snakes are capable of dealing with at least short-term cold weather. This is some thermal data for one snake that made it fairly far. And you can see, so here we have the green is the snake's temperature, the gray is the environmental temp or the air temperature. And what you see is when we get into the fall, these snakes stay underground at night or in the water at night. They avoid these really cold temperatures down here, and they bask during the day to get up to, this is 85 or 90 degrees during the day when they're basking in the sun. So this snake particularly made it through 6 or 7 freeze events before he eventually died during this intensely cold period in January. So I think this idea of range expansion is still very much up in the air, and I think we need more physiological data on these snakes to figure out just how cold tolerant they are, how cold tolerance varies in different regions of their native range, and how that matches up to the snakes in Florida. So I'll finish up here by saying, sort of like I started out, if you had asked me 10 years ago, if you had told me that I'd be up here talking about an invasive giant snake in Florida, I would have said you're crazy. I think this is almost an unprecedented situation that, as a herpetologist, I would never have guessed that it had happened. But now that we've seen these issues unfold, I hope now that you've seen some of the data, you can appreciate that I think this is a serious ecological problem. They seem to be changing the Everglades, and there seems to be no easy solution. So we're developing techniques for how to catch them and how to assess how control measures would work, but there's definitely no easy solution in the future. I think this idea of range expansion is still very much up in the air. I think there's good evidence that it's not just a South Florida problem, but how much further it goes, I think needs a lot more scientific research because we just don't know how these snakes will do further north. And finally, I would argue that invasive snakes are certainly a growing problem that we're going to have to deal with in the future, but it's also an opportunity. These situations can be thought of as natural experiments to look at the role that snakes play as ecosystem components. There's been historically this widespread belief that snakes, they're cool, but they're not really very important. They're rare. They're not major players in ecosystem dynamics. But I think with these invasive snake situations, we're seeing that, yes, snakes can be important ecosystem components, and this is allowing us to evaluate what role snakes play as predators and how they interact with prey. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I will take any questions.
Let's thank him. All right, question. Let's see. Yes.
Regarding the mowing of the Everglades and the species and the snakes that were found dead to get your number of animals per square kilometer, what was the breakdown of invasive species from different pythons, and what native species, if any, were also found in that to get that number?
It was all Burmese pythons. This is in a section that it's outside of areas where boa constrictors or rock pythons are found. So Burmese were the only invasive snake found. These were, the mowers were the people who were mowing were bringing in snakes when they had one. So I have no idea how many natives they found. Most of those probably go undetected because they're smaller. They don't attract vultures. When these mowing events happen, one of the primary ways we find the pythons is that vultures congregate, and you can go find the snake. These are huge mowers that just run through the habitat. So I have no idea how many natives were killed.
You have a question right here?
I'd like to know what laws are on the books that prevent people from importing these snakes. Are there any, and are there any being considered?
So Burmese pythons, along with a couple of the other large species, were recently added to the Lacey Act, which is legislation that basically prevents importation and interstate commerce in those species. So it's now essentially illegal to trade these interstate or overseas. And so within the states, it's all up to state regulations, and states vary dramatically in terms of their local regulations. Some outright ban them, others have essentially no regulations at all. I think I'm up in the air in terms of how I feel about pythons being added to the Lacey Act. in general, but I think a good model is, I think Florida's done actually a pretty good model of state level regulations. They've increased essentially accountability for ownership, so you have to have a permit, you have to have your snake registered, you have to have it tagged. They have amnesty days where if you have an unwanted pet, legal or illegal, you can turn them in with no questions asked. So I think Florida's being proactive and is doing some good things. Most other states don't have nearly that kind of legislation. And some states, I mean, some states it's not even illegal to release your snake. There's nothing on the books that says you can't do that. Although in Florida, the problem is in Florida, at least with Burmese pythons, it's too late. I mean, legislation now isn't gonna stop the problem of Burmese pythons.
Brandon, you got a question right here.
My name is Brandon Matthews. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. Thank you for being here. My question was, the International Union for Conservation of Nature says that these are overexploited in like Southeast Asia for like their meat, their skin, things like that. But here in Florida, they're invasive. So what's kind of like the idea behind protecting something that's being overexploited in another area? Like the species, how here in Florida it seems to be.
It's definitely a huge contrast because they're listed in their native range and they seem to have declined in a lot of places in their native range. One of the ironies of this whole situation is we actually know much more now about Burmese pythons in Florida than we do about them in Asia. Virtually nothing's known about them in Asia. Even the breakdown of where different subspecies occur is not well known. And that's one of the faults with this climate matching stuff is that it's all based on the data from Asia, and those data are not good data for the most part. A lot of them date back to imperial times, like these are accounts of the Raj who went hunting tigers and saw a python eat a antelope or something. And so part of that is a permitting issue. Getting permits to do research in India particularly is really, really difficult. But there are folks in their native range that are trying to do that now. It's amazing that they seem to be so successful here and that they seem to be having trouble in places in Asia. And that's one thing we don't know is what controls their populations in Asia. Why don't they explode in Asia? Those are wide open questions. But it is an interesting contrast for sure.
Have a question at the back, Matt.
How's it going? I'm Matt. I'm a class 9 student here. I'd want to know why they weren't as invasive in Southeast Asia, but I guess you kind of answered that.
They can be successful in some areas in Asia. Burmese are probably less well documented. There's a bigger actually skin trade in reticulated pythons in like Indonesia, and there are still huge numbers, thousands and thousands and thousands of reticulated pythons harvested every year. Most of those, as far as I know, come from sort of agricultural interface areas where they seem to feed heavily on rats and even poultry and things like that. And so they're to some extent sort of supplemented by human activities, whereas in the wild they might be suffering from, say, competition with people for larger prey like pigs or things like that.
Yes, sir, got a question.
Yes, I had a question. These Burmese pythons seem to be a bit unique with regard to other invasive species in Florida. And I'm wondering to what degree the genetic mixing may play a role in the captive propagation of these things for the pet trade, whereas other species like the brown anole, the Cuban anole, where other researchers have shown that where you find really high levels of admixture, you find perhaps better ability for adaptation to these new environments and things like that. And what role do you think that might play in the further expansion of these things?
Right. So excellent question. That's one that I can't wait to hear about. There's a group supposedly working on genetics of these things. We've been sending them samples. I haven't heard much in terms of results yet, unfortunately. And we don't, currently we don't know. There's been a little bit of preliminary genetic data that says, for instance, I guess there's some data that says they didn't come from Vietnam. I don't really know what that means. And there's so much movement in the exotic animal trade in general that just because they were imported from one place doesn't necessarily mean they were from that place. One thing is, if we believe our modeling results and we suggest that the introduction may have happened quite a long time ago, there may have actually been quite a different genetic makeup of snakes that were coming into the country at that point. Most of the recent imports have been from the more tropical areas. Perhaps earlier there was a much wider stock coming in. I mean, one thing I can say personally is having worked with Florida snakes in the lab a little bit and having kept pythons as a kid and things like that, these Florida snakes are not nearly as delicate as the normal captive python. I mean, I had a python get a respiratory infection when I was a kid and I thought I was keeping it plenty warm. These Florida snakes, I mean, we've done experiments where we heat them up, cool them down, heat them up, cool them down. They don't seem to get respiratory infections. They seem to be really, really tough. And I would love to know what the genetic drivers of that are.
Christine at the back.
Hi, you touched on issues with the way the media will get involved in this issue and the misinformation, and you also hinted at policy issues. I was curious what your opinion was on the snake rodeo attempts to deal with this, and is there any good studies collecting people's attitudes towards this issue? I know you mentioned there's some policy issues getting pet owners to be more responsible, but it seems like there's some interesting stuff in terms of villainizing the snakes and the potential issues that come with that.
Yeah, so I personally have been less involved on that end, mostly because I've been pretty removed from Florida. So there are groups at University of Florida and other areas down there that are doing more of the social aspect. They're the ones who organized the Python Challenge, which happened this spring, which was basically a state-sponsored, not quite a bounty, but a contest to see who could find the biggest snakes. They actually did better than I thought they would. There were like 1,000 people registered. They caught 67 snakes, I think, which seems very low, but when you consider that most of those people don't know what they're doing. These snakes are very secretive to begin with, and if you don't know how to find them, even if you know how to find them, they can be tricky to find. And if you don't, you're just wandering around blind. And in fact, in that contest, fully a third of those snakes were caught by one person out of those 1,000 people. So one guy knows what he's doing. And there's one guy this summer who's caught 50 snakes himself already. So the issue of how to promote harvesting of python, or how to balance encouraging public participation in the control effort versus keeping a conservation focus has been a major issue that's been discussed all along the way. And in fact, it's particularly tricky because the heart of the population has traditionally been in Everglades National Park. And so for a long time, and it's still, you have to have a special national park permit to harvest a snake. You're not allowed to harm wildlife flat line in the park. As they get outside the park now, it's more of a free-for-all, but we're always worried about, do you promote killing these snakes because you're sort of promoting this anti-snake? I mean, I'm a snake conservationist. I don't want to promote anti-snake general attitudes. So it's a tricky situation. I think the Python Challenge, they didn't catch all that many snakes. I think it's a good sort of rebuttal to we often get comments that, oh, just put a bounty on them and it'll solve the problem. It's not that simple. But the issue of how much to promote public control versus promoting conservation of all of our native snakes, there's lots of native snakes that we want to conserve, is a really tricky decision-making process.
Yes, this right at the front here. And the microphone's coming, and we'll do one more question.
From a human point of view, are they good for anything commercially? I mean, the skin, are they edible, or are they good for anything?
Their skins are beautiful, and they are edible. The problem with that is, and there's, like I said, a big skin trade and somewhat a meat trade in Asia. The problem is they're hard enough to find that it would be very hard to make a living as a python hunter, except maybe by guiding people who want to go out and catch one. But getting one skin a day, perhaps, is not much of a living in the US. It would be in Asia. But the monetary value is not really there. On the meat side, we're starting to see python appear on menus in Florida, which is, on the one hand, it's kind of interesting, but on the other hand, it's a little bit scary because so far the snakes that have been tested in the Everglades have sky-high mercury levels. They actually have about the highest mercury levels of any animal that's been found in the Everglades, which makes sense because they're top predators, and they're accumulating that mercury as it moves up the food chain. So the snakes we've tested from the Everglades itself are not safe for human consumption. And hopefully those snakes aren't showing up in restaurants on their own.
No, that's okay. She answered your question. She gets your question? Okay. One more question. You got a question? Ben, last question. Hold on. Wait for the mic, Ben.
Ben Croner, Clinton School student here. Thanks for being here. So I know that most of the ways that the snakes are presented seems like very negative, but you also mentioned that there's the potential for positive impacts on ecosystems. And so I was just thinking, if they make their way to New Orleans or to Louisiana, they've had a big problem there with nutria, which are an invasive population themselves, that eat the roots of plants and harm the wetlands in and around New Orleans. So do you do any modeling or predictions about what it would look like?
Nothing quantitative. I can't imagine that a nutria isn't the perfect prey item for a python. I mean, they're in that same marsh habitat. They're just the right size. I can't imagine they're not an almost perfect prey item for a python. So it may be an issue of weighing, the negative impacts of nutria versus having big snakes around. And, I would love it if the overall effects were positive. That would be great. But at least in the Everglades, the effects they seem to be having on native wildlife really, really concerns me personally. Even though things like turtles, I would love to see more turtles. That'd be awesome.
We're going to have to cut it off. I know you've got individual questions, so please come talk to Professor Willson when you get through. If anybody spies a python in Arkansas, please email him so he can know. Let's give a round of applause for Professor JD Willson.